Hello, friends. Welcome to Empty Cloud Monastery in Maya Soma, and I'm here with Bhante Sudaso. And this evening, and also actually with our monastic cat, Teddy. Just show him Bhante. Here he is, our monastery cat, who is not afraid right now, but sometimes actually pretty fearful. So the topic tonight will be facing fear. So we'll share some reflections on this topic. But before we begin, we'll start by paying homage to our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, the reason why we're gathered here tonight. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddham dhammam sangham namasami. All right, well, welcome to a lot of good friends. Hello to Suzanne, Rick, Joe, Manal, Mary, Kumu, Sud, Bhumika, Charlie, and Brian, and Karuna, monastic cat cuddler. Teddy, the monastic cat, is very happy to hear. And at this time, I am going to invite Bhante Sudaso to share some words of Dhamma on the subject matter. And at any time, feel free to write your questions or comments, and so you can also be part of the conversation. And yeah, we'll take it from there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, so just to make a few opening remarks on this, and then I'll pass it back to Ayasoma, and we'll take it from there. Well, first off, when we're talking about fear, the first thing is, as always, to be clearly aware of what's going on in our experience. So not to ignore the sensation of fear or the experience of fear, but to start by actually paying clear attention to what it feels like. So when we're afraid or worried or anxious, what does that feel like? So directing attention to the sensations in the body that accompany fear, and also paying attention to what's going on in the mind. So starting with this, as much as possible, an objective third-person awareness of what the fear sensations are, both physical and mental. And this already tends to produce an interesting change in our experience, in that then it lessens the impact of the fear. So it may not make the fear go away, but just taking a careful observation of the sensations and experiences can already give us a sense that we're not in full control of the fear. And also recognizing that it's something which arises dependent upon conditions. The next thing I would encourage is to start investigating what's causing fear. So what's the underlying tendencies of mind that are leading to fear arising in the first place? So is it coming from some kind of aversion? So often fear is the product of aversion. So it's where we've conjured up an idea of something unpleasant that might happen. So our fear then is related to a hatred of a possible future experience, which then it's a little bit bizarre actually that we do this to ourselves. So because we're concerned that we might have an unpleasant experience in the future, then we produce fear, which is an unpleasant experience in the present. So it's kind of over something which hasn't even happened yet and may not even happen. We're making ourselves uncomfortable right here and now. So this also is something which can start to change our relationship to fear. Investigating what's the underlying aversion, if aversion is the root cause, and most often that is in fact the root cause. So it's aversion to an imagined future. And also looking, well, is there a delusion component here? So is our imagination conjuring up something which isn't real, a possible future which we actually don't know whether or not it's going to be that way, or we're actually not certain. Um, and even if it is something which we're quite positive is going to happen, are we actually sure it's going to be as awful and terrible as we think it will be? So again, starting to investigate what's actually going on in the mind. Less commonly, fear can arise from greed. For example, if we have a strong attachment to something in particular, or a strong desire for a particular outcome or a particular object or a particular experience, there can be the fear that we will lose what we're attached to, or that we won't get what we want. Also, greed can be a basis for fear. And noticing that these bases of fear are all based upon some kind of uh, unwholesome mind state. They're all based upon some kind of greed, hatred, or delusion. So then also investigating that underlying greed, hatred, and delusion, and recognizing them as what they are. No matter how good we are at justifying greed, hatred, and delusion in all of its myriad forms, nonetheless, it's still just greed, hatred, and delusion. It's still just these root defilements which have been tormenting us for longer than we can remember, and which are an entirely optional part of our decisions in life. We don't need to act upon these unwholesome impulses, and we don't need to fuel them. And we can recognize that fear is actually a natural consequence of having greed, hatred, and delusion running rampant in the mind. So again, these are a few reflections on just starting to get some sense of what's going on when we're experiencing fear. And you'll notice that this is all actually pulling our attention away from the presumed object of the fear, but rather looking at what's going on in the mind. So noticing how the mind is generating the fear experience, noticing what that fear experience is like, noticing the unwholesome basis behind fear. So again, I would say that fear is always rooted in an unwholesome state of mind. It's always rooted in some kind of desire, aversion, or delusion. And recognizing that all of this is an impersonal and natural phenomenon, so something that arises based upon causes and conditions. And also, it's optional. It's something which we can alter about our experience. So those are a few opening words on the topic, and now I'd like to pass it back to Ayasoma and see what she would like to add on the subject. So please, Aya, if you'd like to say a few more words.
Thank you, Bante. Yes, what was coming to mind when you were talking is also essentially what we see in the suttas, that sometimes actually after we've done this work of that Bante really greatly illustrated, of understanding the source essentially of our suffering, in this case fear. So where it's coming from and how it comes into being, then sometimes our reaction towards it, with the idea that we're really good Buddhist practitioners, could be to want it for it to disappear while it's still being there, present. And so sometimes we can actually put a lot of effort and strive so much to remove this this emotion, this experience from the mind. And sometimes when we actually go about it in that way, we're not terribly successful at it. And instead, what we see in the suttas, actually, in particular, I'm also thinking about the Bhayabhairava Sutta, that instead the sort of eradication or the transcendence of fear is a sort of natural also evolution of the path. So an evolution of actually the practice of the Noble Eightfold Path, fundamentally, and in particular, actually, the development of sila. So we see, if I remember correctly, in that sutta, the Buddha is approached by a Brahmin who essentially asks him, like, aren't you afraid to go in the forest? It's must be really scary out there. It's definitely, especially back then, they were, pretty wild forest, right, in India. And to this day, with deforestation rampant everywhere, we actually, the forest can still be scary, but not perhaps even as intense and as potentially scary, full of wild animals, full of also like wild humans actually that might attack you at any time, like a den of brigands, how do you say in English? Right, so all of these potential kind of dangers that one would expose themselves with by going into the wilderness. And so the Brahmin asks him, "Aren't you afraid to go there, knowing that the Buddha would often resort to go and practice by himself or with other mendicants in the forest, and also obviously other bhikkhus and bhikkhunis of his that were following him, obviously were also doing this this practice, which was definitely not, kind of the sort of safest practice." And his answer to the Brahmin was something along the lines that, absolutely, me too. When I was an unenlightened bodhisattva, I had that thought. I was like, that's kind of pretty crazy to go voluntarily in that kind of environment. And then fundamentally he starts reflecting actually on his conduct, on his virtue, and using that as a reassurance actually of one's practice, directing one's mind actually towards the wholesome, and being it a support then for cultivating actually a mind that is fearless, regardless of the conditions. So it was less than like, like I should be overcoming this, and rather actually kind of these more soft sort of also recollections of one's own virtue, right? Like so Sila no Sati, Chaga no Sati, and so forth. So all the good deeds that we do, and directing the mind, in towards the wholesome, and using that as a support, as an antidote towards anxiety, as an antidote towards those agitations that can happen in the mind, towards the unknown, and being okay. So then using that as a support for the development also of equanimity towards everything that can happen, and also compassion towards potentially also the people or the beings that might do misdeeds, and a mind of loving kindness towards everyone, mind of joy, which then actually also protects us essentially from encouraging harm, right? So we discourage harm whenever we actually cultivate this wholesome mind state. It's actually very impressive to see practitioners who are so very well developed, for example in metta, whenever they are encountering perhaps even beings in prison, right, that on the other hand have a strong habit of mind towards harming others. And it's really impressive actually how that kind of that aggression has a hard time falling somewhere. There's kind of no ground to fall, because the metta is so overwhelming, so the compassion is so strong, the mudita, the joy, so permeating everything, and also then the equanimity as well, right? So these brahmaviharas. So this is a little bit what was coming to mind. And another reflection also perhaps that I can share is also sort of the positive side of fear, which usually is one of the words that is translated for hiriyottapa, right? So fear and dread. So that fear of potentially doing something harmful, something unskillful, something unwholesome. And that actually the Buddha says throughout the suttas that, hiriyottapa, so fear and dread, are actually the pillars, that these protections, right, that really support the whole world. So it's something actually that we should be cultivating. So sometimes instead of being afraid of others, afraid of what could happen, maybe we can actually be a little bit more afraid of bad conduct that we could do. If we were a little bit more afraid of like the words that could come out from our our mouth, right, that could actually be something a little bit skillful, and afraid not in the sense of paranoid, but rather a little bit putting a little bit to more care, more being a little bit more mindful, right, and having a bit of a wholesome fear of saying something that might hurt others or that might make them a little bit uncomfortable. So these are some thoughts. I don't know if you would like to add anything or.
Well, actually, I see there's some questions appearing, so maybe we can take the questions as the basis for some further conversation.
Sure, absolutely. Let's see. First and foremost, hello to Jason, Margaret, Richard, Luisa, Amy, Marielle. Good to see you so long. Dili Panyankiapo. To see you. And Rick says, Venables, can you share some reflections on how to cope with irrational fears versus prudent fears that arise to warn of real impending danger?
Yeah, well, I think first is actually, to apply what I mentioned earlier. So in being aware of the sensation and the experience of fear, and also identifying any unwholesome component that might be present. But then also distinguishing between these two kinds of fear that you're mentioning. So irrational fear is things like fear of the dark, or fear of things which are really outside of our control, or things which are wildly unlikely. So these are all the category of irrational fears or unnecessary fears. But prudent fear that arise to warn of real impending danger. So this, we actually need to distinguish between awareness of real impending danger, so that's one thing, and fear. So one can be fully aware. For example, you're walking down the street and you see that there's a car coming directly towards you at high speed. You can be fully aware that there is a car coming directly at you, and fully aware that it is wise to step off the street before the car hits you, but without fear. So fear is that panicky, uncomfortable mind state, which again is inevitably connected with some kind of unwholesome mind state. So greed, hatred, or delusion. Whereas awareness of impending danger, that is not an unwholesome mind state. That is not that panicky, awkward, uncomfortable state, which we call fear. It's just awareness that something dangerous is coming, and that might be accompanied then by the impetus to avoid the oncoming danger. So fear is not necessarily a requirement for avoiding danger. Actually, a wise awareness of one's circumstances is the necessary component for avoiding danger. Actually, when people are afraid, they often do phenomenally stupid things and put themselves in really dangerous or hazardous situations. So fear tends to cloud the mind, to make the mind foolish and unwise. It tends to provoke automatic and careless actions. So actually, fear is a very dangerous mind state to be in. When the mind is full of fear, then we tend to make bad choices. We're more likely to do things that we later regret. So actually, when faced with real impending danger, a mind free of fear is ideal. But if fear is present, then the first thing is actually to be perfectly aware that what's going on. It's also not to be afraid of fear, recognizing that the arising of fear in an unawakened being is perfectly normal. Only an awakened being is completely free of fear. Everybody else is going to experience it once in a while. So when it arises, just recognize, oh, this is another natural phenomenon, impersonal phenomenon. It's perfectly normal. And I'm not going to let it cloud my judgment, and I'm not going to let it control my actions. And I'm going to see if there actually is something genuinely dangerous about to happen, in which case I will take the appropriate steps. Okay.
Thank you, Pante. Well, I think you've covered all grounds. Maybe another thing that I could add perhaps would be Sometimes it's also useful to kind of picture the worst case scenario and pretend that it's kind of already happened in your mind. I've done that many times in the past. And certain point, the mind will stop fighting it. If you actually are like, okay, this is happening, no matter what, this is what it is. So the very beginning, maybe the kind of agitation will increase a little bit, and then at a certain point we'll just go like, well, what are you going to do about it? And that what are you going to do about it makes the mind then kind of settle and let go, and that allows for a little bit of space for equanimity then to land. And the prudent fears that arise to warn of real impending danger, one thing that comes to mind is also not to veer on the risky side of things. Sometimes we want to transcend fear, and then we kind of get into the camp of indifference. So that's also not what we're trying to go towards, but rather we want to be, as Bante was saying, we want to let go of these unsettling emotions that are actually obstructive towards actually doing something about the situation, but at the same time keep cultivating the sort of wisdom, the critical thinking that actually makes us aware that perhaps a situation is critical or needs our attention, right? So if there's an impending danger, we don't just want to go like, oh, okay, well, I don't care. I need to be brave or something, but rather not to be silly, not to act out of stupidity. Actually, we see that also in the suttas. The Buddha is very is quoted to use actually sometimes very strong language. So we were reading a passage a couple of days ago in the Sutta Nibbana, where one of the ways that we can tell if we shouldn't do an action is if we're acting out of stupidity. I was like, wow, that's actually like really to the point. We can ask ourselves this question, like, is my intention based on stupidity or not? And so, for example, if there's an impending danger, if there's a tiger, in the next room, and we're like, oh, okay, well, I'm just going to go there so I can overcome my fear. Well, that's a little bit out of stupidity, right? And in fact, we see actually that in the Sampasala Sutta. On the other hand, the instruction is to actually avoid those asavas, avoid those influences. So not to get ourselves intentionally into danger, but also not live with the anxiety that there can be, potential dangers everywhere, because otherwise that will blur our vision. Okay, I see a few questions popping up. Stevie says, fear of lower rebirth is rational. I would say fear of rebirth in general is even more rational. That's what we're aiming at. Not only the fear of lower rebirth, which definitely is much worse than higher rebirth, but just rebirth in general. Actually, the fear of rebirth is what made me into a monastic. At the very beginning, I was kind of like, I don't know about this rebirth, as many, people who convert to Buddhism. And then once I started actually really believing in rebirth, I was like, oh, this is serious. And actually, even a higher rebirth, that's actually kind of almost more awful, because it's like so many eons. And then, as we see in the suttas, after the fun is over, then actually you're back into square one. So yeah, you get a nice break. But then you might be reborn without the Dhamma and do a lot of misdeeds, and then definitely lower rebirth is going to happen. So yeah, that's a wholesome fear, I think, to develop, right? Do you think about it? And Sud says, if someone dies and is fearful at the time of death, will this lead to a lower rebirth?
Not necessarily. So there's sometimes in Buddhist circles, you'll hear a lot of emphasis being put on the final moment of this life as being what determines one next rebirth. But this isn't actually a concept that you find anywhere in the suttas. Instead, what we see in the suttas is the Buddha talking about how what determines our next rebirth is all the karma that we've made prior to the moment of death, including from previous lives. So it's not as simple as just to say that whatever you're thinking in your last moment will determine your next rebirth. It is one factor, but it's just a drop in the bucket. It's the weight of all of one's previous karma that has a much stronger impact on these things. So it's actually quite normal for unawakened beings to have some fear as they approach death. But one thing you can do is to remember all the good deeds you've done in your life. Remember all the wholesome things you've done, all your devotion to Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha, all your acts of dana, sila, and bhavana. And recollecting that all of those are the conditions for good rebirth, and all of those are the conditions for having access to the Dhamma in future lives. So then you have nothing to fear from death. So this is actually one very, very helpful thing you can do. Actually, I think as long as one is really committed to practicing the Buddhist path, then one has no need to fear death and no need to fear rebirth in the lower realms. Just keep one's mind focused on Dhamma, and even if you have some fear as you approach death, it won't be an obstacle for you.
Excellent. Thank you, Bhante. And maybe you want to also answer this one. Do Dhamma protecting Devas play any role in avoiding fear? Does the Buddha talk about anything like this?
So mostly the Buddha talks about dealing with fear by ourselves within our own mind. And he gives many recommendations for that. So one is confronting the experience of fear, as I was talking about earlier. He also talks about recollecting Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha as a way of counteracting fear, reflecting on one's own good deeds, one's own wholesome qualities and wholesome actions. But these are all things that are done within oneself. So is it possible for Devas to diminish or remove the fear from our mind? I mean, maybe. But if so, then that would be the result of our own good karma from the past. Is it worth it to ask the Dhamma protecting Devas to help you out when you're afraid? Yeah, I think it's worth it. But that's actually connected, because the reason why Dhamma protecting Devas protect us is because we practice the Dhamma. So it still comes back to our own Dhamma practice that ultimately is the basis of our protection and the basis of our freedom from fear. So do they play a role? I mean, yes, but predominantly it's our own practice that's the critical piece here.
Thank you, Bhante. And Joe says, what are some skillful ways to give the gift of fearlessness to others? Oh, that's a great question. Actually, developing a mind of loving kindness actually definitely is the sort of easiest, as we were saying earlier, actually, like it's one of the biggest gifts that we can give to others. Actually, it's very evident, for example, with animals. So here now at Empty Cloud Monastery, we have another monastic cat. His name is Teddy, that you met at the very beginning. And he started living at the monastery in January, and he was about 5 years old already, like when he came here, more or less. They didn't know because they found him on the streets. He had been abandoned. And when he came, he was like very skittish, not really knowing who are these people, what are they going to do. He still actually is a little bit skittish whenever during the weekend there's lots of different people coming to the monastery. Also during the week when there's not lots of people coming to the monastery, but more than usual. And he was similarly very skittish at the very beginning with us. But as I always say, dogs give you unconditional love, but cats teach you unconditional love. So that's he taught us, as all the beings, to actually be very patient, very calm, very unconditionally loving. whether, he was nice to us or not nice to us. And at the very beginning, he was very skittish, very fearful, not knowing whether to trust or not these monastics. And then the more we showed him love, the more we showed him compassion, the more we were kind and gentle towards him, the more he started trusting us. And now it's one of the biggest displays actually of trust that predators can do is to actually sleep with their belly exposed, because that's where all their vital organs are. So if a cat, for example, will sleep with their belly up, that means they really trust you. And so he does that all the time, actually, whenever he's around us. So in that way, we've been giving him the gift of fearlessness, at least with us. But I think actually as he keeps living at Empty Cloud Monastery, and he also understands that all the people that come to Empty Cloud Monastery have that same sort of wish of wanting for him to be happy and peaceful. And he's going to, I think, just develop a new way of being fearless altogether. We think that he probably was abused to a certain degree from his previous caretakers, which is why he's a little bit wary. But we are all confident that will disappear as he keeps on staying here at the monastery.
Yeah.
And Maria says, I don't know if I should mention this here, but I've been hospitalized, for over 12 days and sick for over 19. And it's ironic we're talking today about fear, since it has been truly present lately. Please include me in your prayers, so whatever I have is something minor, or that at least I have the wisdom to go through it. Oh, I'm so sorry to hear, Marielle. Should do a little blessing for her right now.
Yeah. Okay, we'll chant a short blessing for you. Sabba roga vinimoto, sabba santa mavajido, sabba viramati kanto, yembuto chatuvam bhava sabitiyo vivanjantu sabba rogo, vinasatu mate mavadvandarayo sukhiri yugo Tanasili Sani Changhunda Pachayino Chandaro Dhamma Vantanti Ayuvano Sukhang Balam.
All good wishes to you. Well, I'm very happy that you're tuning in, actually, Marielle, and that you have the opportunity to listen to the Dhamma, practice the Dhamma with us. It's very important. Actually, my health also hasn't been the best in the past couple of years. And actually, at the beginning of this month, I was on retreat with Vero Bhikkhu Bodhi, and we were doing this retreat on the 4 protective meditations. Which is, one is Buddhanusati, so reflecting the qualities of the Buddha. The other one is Metta meditation. The other one is reflecting Asubha, the ugly parts of the body. And then the last one is contemplation of death. And at a certain point, the contemplation of death became very real because I started having, my arm blocked, and I started having this huge, strong problem here on the chest. And that's usually normally like a sign of an imminent heart attack. And so Bhante Bodhi was actually giving all these guided meditation on, you never know when you're going to die, might be a heart attack. I was like, wow, I might really be having a heart attack and dying here at the retreat. It did not happen, but it actually gave a really, it was a very powerful way of actually contemplating really the nature that we are of this nature to, get sick and this nature to die. So I want to invite you to really take the opportunity to make the most out of the illness, and also like looking at this fear and looking actually at the tension. Even myself, I was like, wow, wow, there's really, like an attachment to this life as well. Like, even though I'm contemplating it, but now that it's more concrete, like, wow, this is what the Buddha is talking about, right? There's that thirst also to want to just simply exist in one shape or form. So, yeah, there is no end of suffering without understanding suffering. So I hope that, yeah, it will be a good opportunity for you to see that. And we send you all our wishes, and for fast recovery soon. And Manal says, I often feel the need to act as fort protector at nights when my partner is away and the children, and I have to secure the doors at night. It's gotten better, but I don't actually sleep. I'm not particularly attached to needing sleep the next few days, so this fear isn't helped. How should I help myself, please? Okay.
Well, well, first off, just acknowledging that this is what's going on. So paying attention to the fear that is arising in your mind and the conditions that are producing that fear. And also reflecting on how many nights have passed without anyone attacking your home. Probably odds are it's not going to happen this evening either. As far as difficulty sleeping, well, again, cultivate your meditation practice. If you're finding it's hard to sleep at night, well, then do some meditation. You can sit up and do sitting meditation, or you can meditate while lying down. But also recognizing that often difficulty sleeping like this, it's related to runaway thinking. And once again, that's an indication that one's meditation practice is something that would be helpful at that particular time. So helping the mind to relax and to observe the flow of thoughts without being swept up in it. And yeah, also just accepting that you're doing the best you can. And if something does happen, well, you can call the police, you can do whatever you need to do at that time. But at this moment, as you're in bed late at night, there's actually nothing to do except cultivate a happy, calm, and peaceful mind. You've already done the best you can to take care of your family and look after your own safety. So laying in bed in fearful thinking is not actually helping the situation at all. Whereas cultivating a calm and peaceful mind is actually the most useful and beneficial thing you can do at that time. So yeah, taking the opportunity to do some meditation. And if you're not able to sleep all night, well, then that's great, because that means you can do 8 hours of meditation. And that's something which will be a benefit to you, both immediately and also in the future.
Thank you, Bante. And Amaranta says, how can I pay tribute to my friend that will go to her funeral?
Monk chat. Can you take that on Friday, monk chat?
Yeah, but we can. I can briefly address it actually now. I think it's usually actually normally we would do an act, a good act, something that is wholesome, and recollect the wholesomeness of that act, and then also share the merit with the departed. And we can do that over and over again. It's not actually sort of occasion specific, not just after the person has departed or the day that they've departed. We can do it actually. It's actually can be a really good way to bring to mind that person sharing the merit and wishing for them to have a really good conditions in their next life, where they can have access to the Dhamma and practice the Dhamma. Do you have any other thoughts about it?
Yeah, I think that's enough for now. Yeah.
And Brian says, I understand how fear is often a result of greed, hatred, and delusion, but what about a sudden scare, like something jumping out of the bushes? Is this related?
Well, so something like that, it's very quick experience, so it's often much more difficult to maintain control of one's mind. So even very advanced practitioners can still be startled. So what you're talking here is more the experience of startling rather than fear. So when there's a sudden, rapid change, and the mind is trying to quickly adjust to a sudden shift in circumstances. So that's not necessarily fear. So it's more a condition of surprise, which can include an element of fear, but not necessarily. But as one's mindfulness and concentration become increasingly well developed, then you'll notice that even in very quick, sudden, intense situations, you're still able to preserve mindfulness and self-restraint. But this is quite advanced. It's usually not something which is going to develop in the first few years of one's practice. But as time goes by, you will start to notice that you don't startle as easily as you used to.
Thank you, Bante. And yes, Stevie, absolutely. Send us a message, an email with your request. And Shadow Label says, why, when I meditate, white lights go through my mind's eye and cause a seizure-like activity, yet still relaxed but filled with extreme fear of anything around me? My doctors told me to consult you. Bante?
I don't know exactly what you mean by seizure-like activity, but relaxed. I mean, white lights appearing in one's mind's eye is not uncommon during meditation, and it just doesn't mean anything. It's just one of the things that the mind sometimes does. It's kind of like background noise in the mind. Doesn't mean anything. Seizure-like activities, twitching muscles. You say twitching muscles. Sometimes that can happen as well. The main thing is just to relax your body and pay attention to the sensations in your body and make sure that you're not producing any muscle movements. But actually, a little bit of twitching muscles is not uncommon. But usually it will settle down as you continue to relax and focus and develop an alert mind. Then that will tend to settle down over time. Focus on relaxation and awareness, and that usually will settle out on its own. As for this extreme fear, well, again, apply what we've been talking about in terms of the sensation of fear. Particularly when it's completely irrational fear, then that's actually ideal, because then you can just observe the fear sensation as just being another impersonal phenomenon moving through the mind. And actually, when you can recognize that it's irrational, then it makes it even easier to observe it without getting swept up in it.
Thank you. And Sergio says, is existential fear fundamentally different from any other fear? When I face thoughts of non-existence, any other fear just pales in comparison. I'd appreciate some reflections on this. Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's actually essentially what we're working with in Buddhism. That's fundamentally dukkha, the real dukkha. Right? So there's lots of different dukkhas, but actually the existential dukkha is what the Buddha essentially is addressing. And so no matter the sort of most incredible sort of state of existence that we can have, like even in the sort of least likely case scenario that anything is going to happen to us that might, make us fearful of that slightly happening, remotely happening, we'll still have to, we're still subject to old age. We're still subject to sickness. We're still subject to death. We're not exempt from any of these three sort of conditions. And, we are very intoxicated with health when we have health, right? Like we're kind of like, oh, this is great. Everything, my body is functioning perfectly. So then the way that, for example, we relate to food is just, I like this and I don't like that, right? I like that the sweets, or like pizza, but I don't like salad. Then actually, because of our perhaps reckless actions, then we get actually very, very sick. And then we start going, actually, wow, if I eat this thing, I'm going to have a really like sort of bad experience. This is not supportive. So we start, looking at it in a different way, because the intoxication with health is disappearing a little bit, and the reality of actually illness being something that is a reality like sinks in, and that's quite agitating, that then that illness can become even something worse. Or maybe we're once again running or being very capable of doing something, and then we hurt our leg and we can't do it anymore. So that's, wow, this actually is it's going to change my life to forever. So that's pretty, it's only like one, it's only going to get worse. And it's the same, even if nothing happens to us, no accident happens, our health is sort of relatively well, we're still subject to decrepitude. That's what actually the aging process is. We like literally start falling apart. And that is horrible. That is really, really horrible. And even if, we age really gracefully and whatnot, we're still subject to death. And also everyone that we love and care for is subject to death. One of my relatives actually died a few years ago, 10 days before turning, or something like that, like a couple of days before turning 100. And she had just done, she had just done her, she had gone to the doctor and everything. Her health was perfect. Doctor was like, wow, it's quite incredible that you're 100 years old. And I was talking to my aunt this last time that I was in Italy, and she was telling me about, because that was her mom. And she was saying, Nonna Amelia just died out of boredom because she was just tired to live, because everyone around her had died. She only had us children, but all her friends, everyone that she loved was basically gone or had some kind of dementia. She couldn't spend time with them anymore. And it was kind of boredom, but also just not wanting to live anymore, essentially. And it was very interesting, this tension, because it once again goes back to this existential nature. We're not exempt from that, even in the best case scenario. Still, even if you're Highlander, to a certain extent, you'll still see other people that are going to die. You're going to be separated by what you love, who you love, and come in touch with the disliked. So yes, it's completely reasonable that it makes you more anxious. And that's what the Buddha says. The first noble truth needs to be understood. That's the truth of dukkha. It's a noble truth. It needs to be understood. And then the cause of dukkha needs to be let go, right? So tanha, this constant craving of wanting to exist in a particular way, or craving not to exist in a particular way, right? And then the third noble truth needs to be realized, and the fourth noble truth needs to be practiced, developed. So that's all we need to do. Always come back to these four cores. And Hannah says, thank you, Bante. I didn't think of the sleepless nights as an opportunities gift, free time to meditate. I shall use that suggestion next time. Sadhu. And Joe says, if fear arises in regard specifically to the fourth recollection of separation, how should one practice?
Well, actually, this is why Ajahn Chah said right view is recognizing that the cup is already broken. So just recognize you've already lost whatever you love. You're already separated from it. And come to peace with that. It was never yours in the first place, and its separation is inevitable. So just come to peace with that. You've already lost it. It's already separated from you. It's already changed and gone. Come to peace with that. And then, if by some miracle you actually are not separated from it, then you can appreciate it while it's around. But first, make peace with it being gone. Okay.
Excellent. And Shadow Label says, what should I do when the white light in my mind and the seizure activity gets to the point where I can't control my body?
Well, first off, if this is happening during your meditation and it's getting anywhere close to that point, odds are you need to use a different meditation method. So if you're using a meditation method that is causing uncontrollable twitching in your body that keeps getting worse, and it's causing increasing fear and anxiety that just keeps getting worse, and it feels like you're actually getting to a point where you might completely lose control of your body, that's all indications that whatever method you're using, you should stop using. And you should be exploring meditation methods that make you calm and relaxed, things that bring a sense of happiness and ease to the mind. So whatever method you're using may just not be right for you. So another option that I would recommend in these cases, by the way, is if this does start happening during your meditation, is get up and do walking meditation. Rather than staying in the sitting posture, switch to doing walking meditation. But also at some point, we also just need to accept the fact that our body is in fact completely out of control. It's just a function of nature. And it does what natural things do. So we have a certain degree of control over the body, but actually the body, it's mostly out of our control anyway. So just accept that this is just the reality of things, is that your body already is out of control. And that's the reality.
And Shadow Label also asks, when should one embrace fear that tells the truth? Like when a bear attacks me and I need to defend myself?
We already answered
yeah,
that.
we answered that. So once again, just as before, it's we don't want to be reckless. We don't want to be insensitive. We don't want to be like apathetic, but rather we want to distinguish a little bit this tangled mess. So nurture the critical thinking, nurture the understanding. This is, a situation where I have to act in one way or the other, and not feed the demons, so to speak, not feed the anxiety, not focus there and going like, oh, I don't like this, I don't want this, may it stop, like I'm afraid of this. That, it's just kind of noise. If it's present, we can't do much about it, but what we can do is not fuel it. It's not, giving it some food, essentially. But we can actually acknowledge that the situation needs to be looked at and confronted, and something needs to be done about the situation. And Rick says, I have fears related to not knowing if my basic needs will be met due to increasing limitations of health, energy, and money due to worsening chronic illness. How do we make skillful choices during this stage of life when our basic needs may not be met?
Well, first off, cultivate gratitude for the fact that your basic needs have been met for most of your life. That's actually pretty amazing. That's not the case for everyone in the world, and it hasn't been the case for everyone throughout human history. So be grateful that your basic needs actually have been getting met. That's pretty amazing. And again, it's not a sure thing. So moving into the future, yeah, it's possible. It's possible your basic needs may not be met, as is currently the case for many people all around the world. So yeah, just make peace with that. Make peace with the reality of the situation. There may be a time when you're hungry and you don't have food. There may be a time when you are sick and you don't have medicine. And in those situations, you're just going to have to face those sensations with mindfulness and equanimity, because you will not have any other option. So that's actually a good encouragement to cultivate your meditation practice now. So while your needs are being met and you are relatively comfortable and you do have a fair amount of time, well, now's the time to focus on building up your mindfulness and equanimity. so that if a situation does come where your basic needs are not being met, then you can face it with serenity and wisdom. Because this is actually the reality of things. And even if by some miracle your basic needs are perfectly met for the rest of your life, you're still eventually going to get sick and die. You're going to get old, you're going to get sick, and you're going to die. This is absolutely inescapable. And so for that also, we need to have mindfulness and equanimity. So that when we're faced with the decline and decrepitude and death of our own body, that we can face it with a serene and wise mind.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, Bante. That was the last question for tonight. Thank you so much for all your great questions, and we will see you again tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. and also tomorrow evening at 7:30 p.m. On Thursdays, we have Asian Thursdays, so we have some lovely monastics from Thailand, a bhikkhuni from Thailand in the morning, Ayake Avansi, and then some bhikkhus from Sri Lanka in the evening, and then with us on Friday morning again. So we look forward to seeing you all, and may you all be well, happy and peaceful. May all good things come to you, and may you have no fear.
And we'll end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu,
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.